So welcome to our latest class in a different room today. We have, as we mentioned, a series of distinguished guest lecturers. We're starting off with Sheryl Hingorani from Sandia National Laboratories in Livermore. Sheryl is a Nebraskan. They directed work in mechanical engineering there. I went to Sandia, where she spent more than 25 years working on nuclear weapons issues at Sandia National Lab. Sandia was in charge of systems integration of the weapons and the non-nuclear components of nuclear weapons. And then a few years ago, we're fortunate here in the Bay Area that Sheryl relocated to the Sandia Livermore campus, where she's director of systems analysis and engineering. It's a large multidisciplinary group she'll tell you about. So this is a discussion more of what is systems analysis about and how does a nuclear weapons lab deal with it, and also some other issues she's going to raise. So please welcome Sheryl Hingorani.
Thank you very much. So I asked Professor Knox, I said, well, should I talk about systems analysis and engineering, which is the group I'm managing, or should I talk about the nuclear posture review? And he said, well, why don't you split it in half and do some of each? So that's what I'm going to do today. And I would be very pleased if you would interrupt me if you have questions or thoughts and not save those till the end. I'm going to talk, just to put it in context, I'm going to talk about Sandia National Laboratories, just give you a little bit of an overview of the institution, talk about our site in Livermore, California, because we have some focus areas that we specialize in. I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I lead and manage. And then I'll talk about what systems analysis is. So I have systems analysis and engineering in my group, but I'm not going to cover the systems engineering part. I'm going to focus on the systems analysis part. I think that's where there's the closer sort of technical policy intersection. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we've been working on. And then a few slides on the 2010 nuclear posture review, and then the looking ahead to the upcoming nuclear posture review for U.S. nuclear policy. And discussion can happen within all of this. So let me ask first, how many of you have already seen a version of this briefing? Because I did brief the NSSC students, and I think some of you might have been there. Okay, so not very many. So that's, sorry to bore any of you that have seen it before, although things are changing so quickly that a lot of this is somewhat new. Okay, so Sandia National Laboratories is what's called a federally funded research and development center. Its roots are in the Manhattan Project, which I think you know began in the 1940s when the US decided to pursue atomic weapons. Sandia was spun off as the engineering lab, so we still have a strong sense of being an engineering laboratory. We work with Los Alamos National Laboratory and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, but those are the two sort of science labs or physics labs. So they're responsible for what we call the nuclear explosive package, but Sandia is the engineering lab that designs not just the weapon system architecture, but all the safety components and security features, and is responsible for the fusing and all of that. In 1956, we established the Sandia site in Livermore, California. So we just had our 60th anniversary in 2016. And one of the things that we are very proud of is the letter from Harry Truman that started Sandia National Laboratories that said, you have the opportunity to render exceptional service in the national interest. So that's our slogan, and it means a lot to people at Sandia. I actually had my 30-year service award, but that's what we're here for, is providing exceptional service in the national interest. Our missions have changed over the decades. We started as a purely nuclear weapons organization, and then over the decades, as the nation faced different challenges like the energy crisis in the 1970s, After 9/11, the focus on countering violent extremism and terrorism, we have been able to take foundational underpinning capabilities of the laboratories and apply those to non-nuclear weapons national security problems. So I can give some examples, or you can ask me for examples if you're interested in that. So this is a view graph that shows the deep scientific underpinnings that the lab has to have in order to do the nuclear weapons mission for the country. So things like material science, computing and information sciences, nano devices and microsystems, geoscience, we can take those, the expertise in the people and also the large experimental facilities and infrastructure, and we can apply those to other national security problems. For example, in geosciences, we have a deep knowledge based on the underground nuclear testing that we did prior to 1992. In the 70s, we were able to apply that to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is an underground cavern where we store petroleum for energy crises. So that's one example. At the California site, which is the Livermore site out here, we really focus on 4 different missions. We do have nuclear weapons systems engineering and analysis. We also have what some people call CBRN defense, or sometimes they add an E. It's chem, bio, rad, nuke, and sometimes people add E for explosive defense. So this is like aviation security and detecting explosives that terrorists might want to smuggle onto airplanes. We do a lot of work for TSA in that regard. We also have a big program in defending against cyber threats at the California site, and there's some really important reasons that our proximity in the Bay Area sort of enables us to have that focus, because we've got the high-tech private sector here. And then we also have a big focus on transportation, energy security, let's just say. So we're doing a lot of work at J-Bay, which is in Emeryville, which is the Joint Bioenergy Institute. We have our own combustion research facility in Livermore. We have something called the Algae Raceway, which is a place where you can test out algae-based fuels for transportation. So that's really the focus of the California site. We have about 1,300 people on site in Livermore. We're across the street from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which has more like 7,500 to 8,000 people, because that's their main site, whereas our site is like a satellite site. More than half, almost 60%, are R&D. And if you can read that, you'll see that we are largely an engineering lab. So we've got electrical engineers, computer engineering, mechanical, and so on. We have fewer scientists and more engineers than the other labs have. And we're quite proud of the fact that even though we're a national security lab with very highly classified technical work that we're doing for the nation, we do have what we call the Livermore Valley Open Campus, where we can have a broader set of foreign nationals on site and participating in some of our research, our unclassified research. Okay, so I was trying to go from Sandia to the California site. Now this is my organization that I lead. It's called Systems Analysis and Engineering. Last year we had a $25 million budget. 86% of that was direct funded by external customers. So these are people in the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, that are paying us to do specific project work for them. A 15% fraction, which I think is too small, is our internal funding, where we have more discretion over the work that we do. About half of our work is on nuclear deterrence, about half is on global security, and then we have little bits of other work there. I don't need to read all this to you, but highly qualified staff, a lot of hiring in the last couple of years, 15 new hires in the last 2 years, working across the United States and even internationally. We have one person in Vienna, co-located with the IAEA. We have another couple of people in Washington, D.C. I have somebody that's leaving for what's called the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the United Kingdom. So we have a pretty big presence nationally and even around the world. 150 international travel days is just to say that we do have people, we do a lot of training and teaching about nuclear security literally all over the world. We had people in Islamabad, in Amman, Jordan last year teaching nuclear security. And then we have a big set of capabilities, like I said, that get applied across the board. And let me see, here's where I'm going to switch to systems analysis. So back in about 1960, MIT had a definition of systems analysis which says it enables the comparison of systems that offer alternative solutions to problems. And at that time, the example they used was long-range bombers versus intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they also had in their definition systems dynamics, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but systems dynamics is a really important part of systems analysis, and we use that approach, often for predicting outcomes of alternative policies. And then operations research is a whole discipline that people get degrees in. So I have several people with operations research degrees. And back then they used the example of analyzing military operations for bombing raids. So last night I looked up in Wikipedia what the definition was for systems analysis. And this is a very nice definition of the work that we do in my organization. Problem-solving technique, decomposing a system into its pieces for the purpose of studying how well those pieces work together and interact to accomplish their purpose. That could be a process, it could be a mechanism, it could be an economic system. I mean, this type of work can be applied in a variety of ways. And another part of that definition was it's an explicit formal inquiry carried out to help a decision maker identify and select a course of action, and a better course of action than they might have otherwise made based sort of on a gut or intuitive feel. So this is really what systems analysis is. We apply it, as I mentioned, to cybersecurity, chem biosecurity, nuclear security, transportation energy security, and we apply this approach across the whole life cycle of national security problems. So early in the life cycle, like cybersecurity is a very good example, where we're trying to do program definitions, scoping studies, characterize the threat, do some scenario planning for the future, do some policy studies. That's kind of how we get started. We call ourselves the headlights of the laboratories, where we're trying to look kind of over the horizon at what the next set of problems might be. And then we do a set of things like we have a deep risk analysis capability. We could do trade-off studies and decision support studies, optimization tools. We create technology roadmaps. I mentioned systems engineering, that I'm not going to talk too much about that. And then we actually support deployed national security solutions with our systems analysis folks. So we have 24/7, 365 technical reach back. So if a radiation portal monitor, so on all the ports of entry to the US, we have monitors looking for radiation signatures. And if one of those alarms, we have the people who, with the backpacks and the pagers, and in 20 minutes, they got to be on the phone looking at the signatures and helping analyze, what should the Customs and Borders Patrol agent do in this case. We also provide that same service for what's called the bio-indoor. We have the bio-indoor reachback center. So there are certain indoor facilities that have biosensors deployed, and that's another thing where if it alarms, we get the call. So any questions on that in general? So I'm going to give you a couple of unclassified examples. just to better sort of introduce you to what systems analysis is. And I was mentioning earlier the Office of Personnel Management. They have about 500,000 people waiting for security clearances. So one problem I'm faced with those 15 people I hired in the last 2 years is that a lot of them are still waiting for their clearances. So what we try to do is find interesting, analogous work, unclassified, but analogous to some of the classified work that we have to do. And so this is an example we called the perfect heist. And we had a couple of our early career employees study high value criminal heists that had occurred, not just in the US, but worldwide. And it was actually published in Popular Mechanics. They took a very rigorous data-driven approach. They created a database, their heist methods and characteristics database, and they looked at 23 historic heists, and they focused on 7 different aspects of those heists. So were there security measures that had been defeated? For example, were there security cameras that had been covered up? Were there doors alarmed that had been somehow that people had gotten through those areas? Deception methods. So this is, obvious kinds of things of, concealing who you are and those kinds of things. How the timing and the target were selected. What kind of weapons were employed. What kind of resources were brought to bear on these heists? So how much funding did people put into this and how much time? Whether or not there were insiders, because the insider threat is also very important with something like protecting nuclear weapons. And then how many failures and mistakes did they, occurred along the way? So again, sort of decomposing all of these into their relevant characteristics, doing some parametric studies, and what we compared this to is the security of nuclear weapons. So we learned a lot from this study. In fact, this has been briefed at the Pentagon to the security forces at the Pentagon. It's been briefed to what we call nuclear matters at the Pentagon. It's been briefed to other locations at the complex where we actually store nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. Let me see if I can just point out a couple of things here. Insider involvement is exceedingly common in heist planning and execution. Multiple insiders are often used. People will take up to 2 years to plan these heists and spend tens of thousands of dollars or more. And so what we looked at then is how the systems we put in place to protect our nuclear weapons, what we assume is the design basis threat, and made some modifications to how we think about what the risk actually is. We created, I don't know if I can actually do it. If I hit escape, well, I wish I hadn't. Well, I shouldn't have done that. To the right here, if I could get to the right. We created like baseball cards. Oh, shoot. No, I can't do it. To the right on the screen, there are 3 like baseball. We created some baseball cards for each of these heists that just talked about, what got stolen, what methods they used, and those kinds of things. Frankly, it'd be maybe an interesting briefing for you all sometime. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, here's another example. This is something that Michael Nacht actually participated with us on, but a couple of years ago, we took some internal funding and we did a 2-week-long summer study looking at cross-domain deterrence. So, historically, people have thought about nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction, nuclear against nuclear, but more and more now in the 21st century, people have concluded that nuclear is just one tool in our toolbox. In fact, Stratcom uses the acronym DIME, which is diplomatic means, informational means, military means, and economic means. So military is just one aspect, and nuclear is just one part of military. But we were able to ask questions about, cross-domain. Are there capabilities, are there cross-domain capabilities that nuclear weapons can deter? Are there non-nuclear attack scenarios for which the US might consider a nuclear response? That would be an existential, overwhelming but non-nuclear situation. The second bullet there was about the 2017 NPR. So the reason I'm pointing this out is because even a couple of years ago, we were starting to look ahead at the policy landscape for the nuclear posture review, knowing that it was still a couple of years away, and thinking about what are the kinds of questions and what might some of the big topics be when we get to that point. And then we were specifically interested in what our systems analysis capabilities could contribute in this area of cross-domain analysis and planning. So that was my way of getting to the nuclear posture review. So in 2010, how many people know that we have a nuclear posture review? Okay, good. Has anybody read the 2010 nuclear posture review? Yeah. So it's online. You can go grab it. Let me see what my next slide is. Yeah. So here's what the objectives are in the nuclear posture review. The statement at the bottom of the page basically says, the threat of global nuclear war has become remote. And the biggest risk today is the risk of nuclear terrorism. And so that really set the tone for the NPR objectives in 2010. The first objective is preventing nuclear proliferation and terrorism. President Obama, I think you know, specifically said we want to reduce the role that nuclear weapons play in U.S. national security strategy. We do want to maintain deterrence, but at reduced force levels. I'll talk a little bit more about this. We want to strengthen our regional deterrence that we provide to our allies and partners. And the last priority on the list, although these weren't necessarily in priority order, but the last priority was maintaining a safe, secure, effective nuclear deterrent for the United States. So in my view, well, we've done a few nuclear posture reviews in the past. I think 94, 2001, and they were very DoD-centric. They were very focused on nuclear force structures, although I guess in 2001 we did broaden the concept to include defensive capabilities and so on. But this nuclear posture review is where the DoD really reached out to not only the Department of Energy that does the nuclear warhead technical work, but also the State Department. There was a big outreach to our allies. And so this was a more sort of comprehensive, integrated look at nuclear posture than had been done previously. And sometimes I talk about, the road from Prague to Berlin. So before the NPR came out, President Obama talked about his vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, put an end to Cold War thinking. But as long as they exist, we're going to have a safe, secure, effective arsenal, not only for ourselves, but for our allies. Then the NPR came out and the New START Treaty was ratified, which I'll mention a little bit more about in a minute. We started the nuclear security summits, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty only covers strategic deployed weapons. So in Seoul in 2012, President Obama said, we're also interested in seeking reductions to non-strategic weapons and non-deployed weapons or warheads in reserve. And then a year later in Berlin, stated that we could meet our national security objectives with an additional 1/3 reduction in our arsenal. So that was basically going from the START treaty limit of 1,550 to 1,000, which we've talked about now for about 25 years, going to 1,000 nuclear weapons. and at the same time working with Russia and NATO to get tactical weapons out of Europe, or to seek bold reductions in tactical weapons in Europe. So that, well, and then basically this is like from Prague to Berlin to Crimea, because after Crimea annexation, things really broke down between US-Russia relationships. And so we haven't borne the fruit of really any of this, follow on to New START treaty, all the thinking that went into what are the next steps beyond the New START treaty. So we've turned all of that into a very detailed implementation plan, and basically it goes out through this I think only goes out to 1941 because it's a 25-year plan, but there is a plan for modernizing the stockpile through 2080. There's actually a plan that goes out to 2080. And the point here is that we can have fewer nuclear weapons, but they can't be the old. We've got to address the technology obsolescence and the aging in the stockpile if we want to have an effective deterrent for the United States. So I think this is, cost is a really big deal. So a lot of reports have been written that basically say we're going to spend $1 trillion modernizing both the nuclear warheads and the delivery platforms. And the cost is really going to moderate the pace at which we do this and really how much of it we actually do. Some people view the life extension programs for US nuclear weapons as just a bridge to zero. Eventually, we want to be in a world without nuclear weapons. We're not there yet. We'll just life extend what we have until we can imagine a path to a world without nuclear weapons. And so some people have viewed those as a bridge to zero. Other people view them as a really important part of US national security strategy. And to be honest, President Obama and Congress agreed on $1 trillion farm bill. So $1 trillion isn't outside the realm of what, a major power can spend on an important outcome, an important government-supported outcome, but still it's a lot of money. $1 trillion is a lot of money. And some people think nuclear deterrence is a relic of the Cold War, and why would we spend $1 trillion on this? So before President Obama left office, he was asking for ideas of how to further his legacy of what people call the Prague Agenda, the Prague speech in 2009. And it was leaked to the Washington Post. If any of you followed that at the time, there were 8 to 10, I think, ideas of ways that the president could cement his legacy on reducing the role that nuclear weapons play in U.S. national security strategy. And, as those ideas were coming up, there was a letter. It's from McCain and I don't even remember now. It was an important thing that when Medvedev and Obama signed the New START treaty, the Senate went along with ratification in exchange for the administration supporting stockpile modernization. And so even as recently as this past fall, this letter pointed out that, we supported New START because of the commitments you made to stockpile modernization, and so we have to go forward with that. So this is the way I think about this. I won't go through, I could talk for a long time about this, but I'll just cover it briefly. I feel like we're a few years into a third era in US nuclear weapons program. I don't know about policy. It used to say policy here, but I'm talking about really the work that the nation is doing programmatically, the funded work that we're doing. So during the Cold War, people are pretty familiar with the fact that we were in an arms race. We had a rapid parallel development programs going on. At one time, we had 14 different U.S. nuclear weapons that were being designed and engineered concurrently, which is unheard of today. And the whole objective was really to maximize the explosive output of those weapons, given the weight and volume constraints. And cost was not a factor. It was the #1 national security need. However much it cost was how much it cost. Then when the Cold War ended, we created something called science-based stockpile stewardship, because two things changed. The Cold War ended, and we took a unilateral moratorium on underground nuclear testing. So we haven't ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which even that wouldn't enter into force until some other countries had ratified it, but we have not done any underground nuclear testing since 1992, I believe it is. And so the big iconic challenge for the nuclear weapons program was to create the computational capabilities and the experimental capabilities to substitute for underground nuclear testing and still provide confidence in the reliability and the health of the nuclear deterrent. We made big investments in the scientific infrastructure, but the requirements for the stockpile weren't clear because we didn't know if it was a resurgent Russia that we would be facing. We didn't know if it was China that was going to become a peer nuclear competitor. And so then when the NPR came out in 2010, it really put us on a path of integrating some of these deterrence and global nuclear security aims. Because we had gone 20 years without doing much to the stockpile or the production infrastructure, there were some urgent needs. It's a huge scope of work, $1 trillion worth of work that has to happen, and we're in this period of fiscal austerity and uncertainty. So it's just a very different time, and we're we're making progress. We've actually had some big successes. So the thing is, a lot has changed since 2010. A lot has changed. In fact, Brad Roberts, who you're going to see next week, he was right in the middle of the NPR in 2010. And I think, Michael, you were involved as well. And Brad will say that back then, with Medvedev in power, they couldn't think of a single pathway to nuclear conflict between the US and Russia. And frankly, now, there are a few different scenarios that could play out to that, hopefully not inevitably, but in some extreme case. So there's things going on with Russia. There's the pivot to the Pacific and the thinking about China and their A2AD strategy, anti-access area denial strategies. Certainly North Korea, things have gotten worse and worse with North Korea. We do have the Iran agreement in place, and people differ about, have differences of opinion about how successful that might be. India-Pakistan developments have changed a lot since 2010. And then we do have ISIS. And historically, we've said that nuclear weapons aren't really relevant to terrorist organizations, mostly because they don't have territory, they don't have leadership targets that we can hold at risk. And some of the things happening with ISIS make you start to think, well, wait a minute, is that earlier conclusion that we drew, actually true today? So these are examples of the ways in which nuclear deterrence could be challenged in the future. For deterrence to be successful, you have to be able to hold targets at risk. And there has been a big proliferation, both in the sophistication and in the globalization of air and missile defense capabilities. A lot more underground facilities. While we're in a mode of restraining our military capability and our nuclear deterrent, other countries are doing a lot more offensive modernization. And so we could be faced with a technology surprise kind of situation. You can read articles about the escalate to de-escalate strategy, the idea that in a regional conflict, if it was escalating conventionally, a sub-strategic warfighting use of a nuclear weapon could be used to de-escalate that conflict. That's in some of the doctrine, the Russian Federation military doctrine. We could have a lot more proliferation, even by our allies, if they doubt the credibility of our deterrence umbrella to them. And then there are a huge number of asymmetric or disruptive emerging threats, cyber attacks, supply chain attacks, anti-satellite capabilities, and possibly other technical breakthroughs like cloaking, or there are so many things, quantum computing. There are many, many things that could cause a disruptive change to our deterrence posture. And so my basic solution to this is optionality and agility. I mean, we need to be able to be agile. We need to be able to provide options for the nation. And that's one of the things we're trying to do. So the 2017 Nuclear Posture Review is getting started. In 2010, there was a very long congressional act or sub-element of probably the National Defense Authorization Act that called for a nuclear posture review, and it outlined very specifically what was to be included. Today, Congress has not required a nuclear posture review, but President Trump did sign an executive order that included this statement right here, and I think it will set the tone. Ensure that the U.S. nuclear deterrent is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and tailored to 21st century threats, and reassuring our allies. So that's a different tone than the tone that we had in 2010. We'll have to see. So the little pictures that I have here, one is, I don't know if people saw this, it was reported in the open source news, but Chris Ford, Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director for WMD and Counterproliferation at the National Security Council, he participated in a Carnegie Endowment sort of discussion, moderated discussion, and I'll just read a part of this. This was very recently, March 21st. He said, as we scope the NPR and the framing questions, the 2010 NPR looked through a lens of the Prague Agenda concept of a world without nuclear weapons, and this new NPR is going to be more pragmatic. He's making the point that it's not practical to think about a world without nuclear weapons. And we'll focus more on programs more directly related to our security needs, the strategic environment of the future. We want to enhance the security of the United States. And it says the contemporary threat environment looks notably different from that of 2010. So, and then there's many, many pages of other things. But I think the point is that's the basic consensus that's developed, is that the changed and changing world, it is different than it was in 2010. And then that second picture is General Hyten, who's the commander at STRATCOM, is going to be testifying tomorrow, actually, to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he has similar things to say about nuclear deterrence. So this is, I believe, yep, my last slide. And it's a model that I use to try to somewhat disparate objectives together. At the top there, we have to demonstrate commitment to nonproliferation and arms control efforts. We are signatories to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. There are other arms control efforts that we're party to. We have to prevent unauthorized use of nuclear, access to or use of nuclear materials or devices or weapons, and we have to prevent nuclear accidents. We have to deter strategic attack on the U.S. forces abroad or our allies, and a little bit of a paradox that for global nuclear security and stability, we have to be able to effectively employ nuclear weapons and restore deterrence if deterrence fails. So that's the way I think about global nuclear security and stability, and others view it differently, and that's fine, but this is kind of the model and the way that I think about it. I have been working for about 3 years now, both in our nuclear weapons strategic planning and foresight and scenario planning, and also managing the work we do for the Department of Homeland Security on rad nuke terrorism, countering rad nuke terrorism. So my last couple of years have been focused on sort of how do I talk about this as one portfolio of work that's sort of got a consistent integrative theme to it. That's my talk for tonight. So I would take questions, comments, thoughts, criticisms, but I won't take no questions, comments, thoughts, or criticisms. I can get a $5 bill out and give $5 to the first question.
Okay. So on the earlier slides where you discussed insights that you might have gotten from some of these heist scenarios,
yeah,
what would be some good examples? Like I know that in the case of certain museum heists, there's a lot of social engineering going on, people getting access to areas they're not supposed to because of sort of some negative fields.
Right. So, well, I mean, examples that are relevant, I think, are in terms of the insider threat, right? So there were people who got hired to work in the bank and therefore had access to the safe deposit box area. There were people who got hired to be security guards. So their motive already existed, that they wanted to pull off this heist, and then they would apply for a position with a security firm or with the bank in question. And so, many times we do care about insider threats in the nuclear security enterprise, but many times we're not as focused on that because everybody has a security clearance. Everybody has gone through a background check. It's much harder, I would say, to have an insider threat in the nuclear security world. But it was things like that where people would go to a lot of effort to either recruit an insider or become an insider themselves, sometimes over years of time with this objective in mind. Another example that was listed on the slide, but it said they often used creative but not necessarily high-tech ways to get around systems. So there was one example where there was a security camera was sprayed with hairspray, basically, that somehow covered that up. And there was a magnetic door alarm, and they basically just detached the second magnet and just put it on the door. So the door could be open, but the magnet was closed, but the door was open. So there were many, many things like that where we hadn't necessarily thought about the kind of low-tech ways that people could get around some of the very common security features. There also were a number of times when security personnel were in place, but not paying enough attention to notice what was going on. So those are the kinds of things that we learned a lot about. Yes?
It may vary from NPR to NPR, but for example, going back to 2010, are these just selectively chosen individuals, or do agencies and labs corporately get involved as sort of a reach-back capability? The associate directors, weapons directors get involved? How does this actually work in practice, and how many people take part?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It does vary each time, and it depends on the leadership involved. I can tell you that in 2009 or 8, There were some, of course, there were some STRATCOM special task forces going on that were trying to get ready for these kinds of questions. The DOE/NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency, hadn't been very involved, and so when they were invited to come to the table, they wished that they had done more sort of greasing the skids, laying the groundwork for their participation. That's one reason that this year we have taken some time at the labs to write some background papers with some policy options and pros and cons of those options for the transition team. I mean, I think if Clinton had won the election, she probably would have wanted to put her stamp on it, but she probably would have continued a lot of what was in the 2010 NPR. So a lot of our options were, steady as she goes, or you could do, this variant or that variant. Now, with the new administration coming in, there could be something quite different. As far as I know, this current NPR, the two sort of co-leads are in OSD policy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff right now. There are two individuals who are going to lead the effort going forward. And then as other people get put in place and confirmed, it might change. The leadership might change. Yes?
So earlier you said that there was a lot of consensus about how things have changed since 2010, but just now you said that you think the Clinton administration would have continued the 2010 policies, which seems, so what is the consensus among people of the same ideals, or how could the same policy be carried out if so much has changed?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think, even the fact that last fall, President Obama was committed to some announcements that would further the Prague agenda shows that there is a difference of opinion. Okay? So one approach is to say, okay, Russia and China are much more aggressive in terms of modernizing their nuclear capabilities, but we're not going to mirror them. We're not going to restart an arms race with them. We're going to create the nuclear deterrent force that we think we need for our national security needs. The problem is that we do have guarantees to allies that are in regional security contexts with Russia or China, Taiwan, for example, some of the NATO countries. So I think I don't have a good answer for you. I think a lot has changed. I personally was surprised that there would be, at the end of the Obama administration, a look for ways to cement that legacy. On the other hand, there were 8 to 12 things, and really the only thing that happened is Biden made an announcement that we were going to dismantle some additional weapons. So I think the variants that we presented in some of these background papers were excursions off the baseline, and possibly the baseline approach of life extending the Cold War stockpile really wouldn't have been, like I said, we presented pros and cons. So that may not have been selected even by the Clinton administration. But I think it wouldn't have been a big departure, whereas I think this is an opportunity to rethink the whole thing. In fact, if you can get a hold of this Chris Ford discussion with the Carnegie Institute, there are some big things that they're challenging. I mentioned the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, but there's quite a lot of other things like the Iran deal, how we've been handling North Korea. It's an opportunity for a new administration to revisit things. Other comments or questions? Yes.
So I read that there was recently some sort of UN meeting which all the P5 powers had opposed, or either voted against or had abstained from, where they were discussing like a world without nuclear weapons. Would that have been consistent under the 2010 nuclear posture review? Or?
I don't know enough about the terms of that. I don't know enough about what we would have actually been signing up for. Is there, I don't know if you know more about it or not.
This was what you went this was about getting rid of all nuclear weapons.
Yes, this is I don't know what exactly, I do know that the Navy is great.
Yes, and there have been many initiatives by, we used to go the non-aligned group for members of developing countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America, who are parts of the APT, basically going to the nuclear club, which is the permanent members of the UN Security Council, all five of the nuclear weapons states, US, Russia, China, France, and Britain, and say, NPT says we're going to move toward nuclear disarmament. Get on the stick, move faster. Now, there's been tremendous cutbacks, seen the US-Russia stockpiles, almost 90% cuts since the peak of the Cold War in 1967. But, certainly this administration doesn't want to engage in it.
So the question for Chris Ford at Carnegie was, negotiations get underway later this month, this was back on March 21st, for UN on a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. What's your position? And obviously it says, we staunchly oppose this. But I think the question is, what would the Obama administration have done and the Clinton administration have done?
The Obama administration would say, we're pathetic, we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. And he clearly was on the forward leading Obama on the war without nuclear weapons of every U.S. president since Truman. No one's ever said this. That he really has a vision and a goal, and really wants to stop moving things that won't even be his lifetime. Really wants to do. No president's ever said that before. But now, we don't actually know President Trump's position.
We'll never know. Yes.
First of all, I have to confess that I don't know a whole lot about designing nuclear weapons, but
It's a good thing.
I'm a little wondering, so reducing stockpile and modernizing, as an engineer, it seemed like they could be somewhat related in terms of optimizing. But I guess the amount of money given to the effort either way makes a big difference. If you're adding extra funding to modernize versus reducing funding to reduce stockpile because you're reducing maintenance costs. I'm curious how much room there is between the talking points of policymakers and the actual technical work of people at the labs in terms of how much room for interpretation is there in Russian Google.
Well, I didn't include a couple of slides or a few slides that sort of show, if you don't mind. I'm not a Mac person, so unfortunately. So this is the unclassified version of the number of nuclear weapons that we've had over the decades, right? And this next one is a little bit hard to interpret, but basically the weapons are on the chart in the year in which they were deployed into the stockpile, and the white ones are already out of the stockpile and the red ones are still in the stockpile. So there's a few things that drive cost. I mean, one is the number of weapons. Another is the number of different warhead types, right? So if I have 1,000 of the same weapon, that costs less than if I have 1,000 and each weapon is unique and different from the other. The modernization programs themselves, which are these life extension programs, cost a lot of money. I mean, one of the reasons why the nuclear weapons enterprise is expensive, we say always never. Nuclear weapons must always work when commanded and authorized by the President of the United States, and never under any other circumstance. And that's a big engineering challenge, and it requires that we do things like high margin, redundant systems, all kinds of multiple independent safety systems that would all have to fail at the same time for an accident to occur. So it is an expensive enterprise. And also, without underground nuclear testing, and there's a good reason why we have a moratorium on underground nuclear testing, but we have had to create really expensive tools and scientific understanding so that we can still certify to the president every year that the stockpile is safe, secure, and reliable. So I would say, it's like, we sometimes we say it's like riding a bike, okay? There is a speed at which you cannot ride a bike anymore, because it's just you've got to be going at some speed to stay on the bike and for the bike to not be unstable. We've got to have this sort of baseline level of scientific research and technical depth in order to be confident in the stockpile. And then on top of that, you've got these fairly big modernization programs of a very high consequence product. And so it is expensive. And I don't know if I answered your question or not specifically, but.
It's just that whether we have a modernized stockpile is whether each weapon fulfills some criteria, not whether our entire stockpile is capable of some impact. Because you could potentially neglect certain weapons and focus on other ones, reducing the stockpile, but also increasing the capability of the weapons.
Well, so that is what we've done, though. I mean, over the years, we have taken systems out of the stockpile, a lot of them, and we've reduced the numbers. So right now, there are 11 nuclear weapon types in the stockpile. And at the end of this modernization era, we're going to have five different types. So the cost to maintain those 5 types will be lower than what we spend today to do 11, but I still got to get over this big hump of funding in order to do the work. I've got to dismantle, a number of weapons. I've got to refurbish and remanufacture some parts. I've got to replace. A good example is, and you can read about this in the Washington Post, we've got vacuum tube radars in some of our old systems. And when we modernize those systems, we put in what are called RFIC, radio frequency integrated circuit radars, right? So it costs money to have the people that know about vacuum tube radars, because I got to pay people to know that stuff. And it also costs money to have people to design the next generation of modern radars, because even if I wanted to just put new vacuum tubes in, I couldn't do that. So it's a very expensive proposition. It really is. And I think the disagreement is more about, the policy level disagreement is the amount of money that we're spending. Here's my view of the policy question. We're spending a lot of money to life extend the Cold War stockpile, and we absolutely have to do it because of technology obsolescence and aging. If you talk about a world without nuclear weapons, but you look, I don't have it, sorry. But you look at what, if you look around the world, we're not going unilaterally. So it's only an option if we can bring everybody else along. So if we can't yet, and we can't have it, then you've got to address aging and technology obsolescence. And the question is, do you also want to adapt the U.S. nuclear deterrent to an uncertain future? Or do you want to simply restore the capabilities that were relevant in the Cold War? You're welcome. Yes?
I am curious as to reasons there are not to resume testing. Because we talk about sort of extending the lives of these systems that were designed, in the previous century, well into the 2080s. As a physicist with some experience in the high energy density physics, plasma physics, fusion world, I'm very skeptical of extrapolating results from small scale experiments to a full scale system. And so personally, I would not trust any weapon to work based on, I don't know, shock propagation experiments on the Z machine or something. I'm personally skeptical of that, but what are the consequences of resuming testing?
Well, first of all, I've worked for 30 years at Sandia Labs. So as I mentioned before, we're the engineering lab. We're not the science lab. We're not responsible for the nuclear explosive package. We're responsible for the warhead systems integration and engineering and the safety and security componentry and so on. So I can't speak for the physics labs, but I will tell you that every year, each of the lab directors has to certify to the President of the United States their ability, their confidence in the safety and reliability of the stockpile, and the fact that we do not need to resume underground nuclear testing. So I'm not going to call that into question. There are technically brilliant people that are absolutely accountable for delivering this certification to the President every year, and they say that we can do it without underground nuclear testing. Now, we do have a test readiness program. Because if there was either a geostrategic reason to do an underground nuclear test as a demonstration of capability in response to something going on around the world, we have to be able to do that. And if there was a technical problem in the stockpile that couldn't be resolved through subcritical, above ground computational capabilities, we have a test readiness program, and we have to be be ready to test if the nation decides that we need that. So I can't say more than that for my own personal accountabilities in this matter.
Do you mind if I tag on to that one?
Sure.
Of course, one of the things to keep in mind is that Batman, the first nuclear weapon ever dropped, actually was not a tested design in any capacity, and it functioned. And so I'm not saying that extrapolates to modern weapon, but to say that there is an expertise on demonstrating this capability in the absence of experimental information is maybe a bit of a stretch.
I think one thing that is clear, if you look at the NNSA Stockpile Stewardship and Management Plan, which is on the internet and you can read it, what I mentioned on one of my slides is that there are urgent needs in the stockpile and also the production infrastructure. Okay, for 20 some years, we made big investments in the scientific research infrastructure, but we didn't do much to the stockpile and we didn't do much to the production infrastructure. So there is a plan that's described in the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Plan for reestablishing a production infrastructure that can manufacture nuclear explosive components. So when I say the plan goes out to 2080, that doesn't mean that we're going to take the existing nuclear explosive packages and we're going to have those all the way through 2080. The plan through 2080 does include remanufacturing some of the designs that we have confidence in based on our underground nuclear test certification basis, and just remanufacturing those components for the future. Other questions or comments? Yes? Oh, one more. Go ahead.
Is there a plan to account for loss of expertise over the 2080 span?
Well, that is an excellent question.
You guys have to have children and grandchildren.
Exactly. So if we have more time, and I don't know what time it is, but I don't want to take up your time, but I will say this has become more important to me than it ever was before. You know, even the near-term modernization programs that we're embarking on. So you can read in the newspaper about what's called a long-range standoff capability, which is a cruise missile capability. And the first one of those, I could have the dates on. Let's just say it's 2030. I'm not going to be here in 2030. I mean, I'm going to be here on Earth, hopefully, but I'm not going to be working at Sandia. And so even the programs that we're actively working on now, we have to transfer the knowledge. There's a new program authorized by Congress called the Stockpile Responsiveness Program, funded a little bit this year, funded more later, maybe as much as $100 million a year, you know, over the years to come. And it has an explicit aim of partnering early to mid-career employees with late career or even retirees as mentors in order to work together through the decades to come. And if we can get the rhythm, if we can establish some kind of rhythm associated with that, that's going to be important. What I worry about is, I think the national security missions more generally have a hard time competing for top technical talent in this country, because some of the people graduating our universities aren't U.S. citizens, and that does preclude them from working on, you know, the highest classified work. And then I think that we can't compete really with the private sector on compensation and benefits and things like stock options. We just have the mission, you know, and we can attract people if they're, you know, if they really are excited about service and serving the nation. And if they're willing to, you know, forego the private sector narrative, and especially the Bay Area narrative of, you know, making your first $1 billion by the time you're 28. So it's a big problem. It's a big issue, and we've got to pay a lot of attention to that. We have student intern programs. We have mentoring programs. We have something called our Weapon Intern Program, our National Security Leaders Program. The National Defense University has a program for emerging leaders. I mean, everybody cares about this. And I think it's sort of 1,000 flowers blooming more than it is an ingredient.
Part of the subtext of why we have the guest lecture series here is to expose you to the opportunities of the national labs. You'll hear from Brad Roberts more and Livermore. I don't know if we can agree. Los Alamos coming up at least this year. But, and the MNSC was funded as an sort of as a consequence of the 2010 NPR, which Berkeley leads. It's a $25 million center. We have 8 premier research universities, 5 national labs. It is to prepare a conduit by which you guys can have fantastic jobs in the national labs. In fact, we funded 150 students in 5 years at these universities. 50 of them are now employed in the national labs. And they're great. I spent 25 years of my life, but it's a career to die for. It's a dream career. And Sandia, being kind of the consummate technology lab, Sandia is all around you. You don't know. I mean, when you go to the airport, you went home for spring break, and you went through one of those scanners where you had to go like this. That's a Sandia technology.
So I should say, it is a $3 billion a year institution, Sandia is. And half the work is nuclear weapons related, and half the work is other national security. It's like Homeland Security and so on. So there actually are a lot of ways that Sandia has touched your lives. Okay.
So please thank Sheryl Hingorani. Until 22, we'll have our second speaker, Braley. and very clever topic. How to make americium.
Making americium hexavalent again.
Yeah, okay, this is going to be a little bit different. Take it away, Professor Braley.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. All right, so I don't have slides prepared for you guys because I was knowing that this was a very diverse class as far as technical backgrounds, et cetera. I was going to try and take some cues from the audience as far as how I march through things. I'm a chemist by training, and so I can get carried away on the chemical details of reprocessing. So if you have questions over the course of this, and things don't seem obvious to you, they probably don't seem obvious to other people in the room, please don't hesitate to pause me. But we'll go ahead and march through this. So I probably about 50, half my PhD was spent looking at why you might, the chemical processes that you might develop for waste management and basically streamlining up peaceful reprocessing means, why you might be interested in that, in developing those types of processes. And the other 50% of my PhD was actually spent developing chemistry to remediate the Hanford site in South Central Washington State. So have you guys heard about the Hanford site? Oh, I've seen some head nodding and things of that nature, right? So, the Hanford site is probably the most labyrinthine task as far as cleanup within the Department of Energy complex. And it's because, in part, they used 3 different separation processes to recover the plutonium that they were trying to develop over the course of World War II and the Cold War. And over the course of looking at all those processes, they developed, they were storing the leftover material in tanks. There's 177 underground storage tanks at the Hanford site, storing at least 1 million gallons of, 100 million gallons, I think, actually, of used nuclear material, radioactive waste, in various chemical configurations that is not well categorized. And so that's a unique challenge there, but also a little bit about those processes that they were using, and then how we kind of landed on the process that we've got today. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an outline as to how that looks in and what they were doing at the Hanford site. It ends up being kind of a nice case study for reprocessing. So let's get right to this. So when you have a reactor, right, you usually have your uranium-238 in there. You guys have seen this, I believe, before. And so you end up capturing a neutron on this. This undergoes some form of a N-gamma type reaction. You get your uranium-239. This undergoes beta decay to neptunium-239. And then this, of course, undergoes beta decay to plutonium-239. So we have a series of neutron captures and beta decays that are producing basically your heavier actinides and getting your plutonium. What else is happening in the reactor from a chemistry type perspective as these things are undergoing fission? What else are you making? Yeah. You're making fission products, right? So on some level, you're undergoing neutron capture and beta decay to make your heavier actinides like your plutonium. And then on the other side, you're also making fission products. So we've got fission products. And the fission products end up comprising, so if we look back to our days of our periodic table, and see most of you have your laptops out, you can Google your periodic table now and dust out that memory. You actually end up making about 2/3 of the periodic table over the course of the fission process. You don't split this right, the atom right down the middle of it, right? And just get 2 silver 111s or silver atoms. That would make a really simple separations challenge and basically a lot of silver, which actually wouldn't be so bad as far as the process is concerned. But you end up making a pretty good spread of things. And so because of this, another complication that arises from the fission products is they have what are called high neutron capture cross sections. You guys talked about neutron capture cross sections and things of that nature, right? So your fission products go in, and instead of neutrons going forward and either forwarding the fission process, which is usually what you want on some level, right? You want more energy produced from that in a commercial type reactor, or in a weapons reactor, right? You want to be making more plutonium-239. They're actually being captured by the fission products. And so usually you need to take the uranium out of the reactor. In a commercial process, maybe when you've only consumed about 5% of the uranium-235. So in theory, you can keep burning this uranium for much longer, but it's actually the fission products that get in the way of your ability to do that. Or if you're running a weapon cycle, what happens if you keep leaving this fuel in there for a while and you make plutonium-239? What happens if you leave it in there longer? Yeah.
So if plutonium 240 and 241,
Yep, absolutely, right. So you start making your plutonium-241, 240, plutonium-240 in particular has a tendency to undergo spontaneous fission, right? And so as you're trying to assemble this weapon, a stray neutron kicks out before it should have to kick off the chain reaction process, right? This is maybe not what you're trying to go for when you're designing a weapon. And so usually when you're operating a reactor and you're trying to make plutonium for weapons out of it, we bias towards relatively short radiation times of fuel or longer radiation times of fuel. Short, right? And so that was precisely what they did at the Hanford site. So those radiation times were on the order of 3 to 6 months. And from that perspective, this is exactly why we maintain an eye towards how long fuel is being burned in commercial reactors across the world, right? So if the fuel is not being radiated for as long, then it maybe indicates that you're interested in doing something with fuel other than just storing it or recycling it to put back into a reactor, right? And so as a consequence of this, even when you make this plutonium-239, and maybe you will make less fission products or less 240, you still want to get the fission products out of there. You want to yield of your device if you're looking to weaponize or to improve the quality of your MOX fuel if you're looking to put plutonium back into the reactor. And that's precisely why you would process. And so you can imagine with sort of that dual-sided capability that there can be immediate questions that fall in as to if a country starts moving towards reprocessing, right? Because all of a sudden is that material going to get subverted into something that's not necessarily MOX fuel, but potentially a plutonium-type weapon. So that's why all these questions manifest. So when it comes to reprocessing, I'll say, so here's the U.S.'s historic, let's see here, separations chemistry. So we'll go ahead and kind of set the framework for this here. So what you actually had were, as I mentioned for the Hanford site, 3 different processes that were developed. And so one of them was what was called the bismuth phosphate process. You guys know where that was discovered? Anyone? Berkeley, home of the bismuth phosphate process. So Seaborg, in his discovery of plutonium, and then what else did Seaborg go do? Discovered 10 other elements, 100 different isotopes. He maybe did just a few things right over the course of his career. He also developed the bismuth phosphate process. And this is basically, they took this, they used this to separate the first microgram of plutonium, and then they used a scale factor of on the order of 10 to the 8, which is completely unheard of, I'm told, from a chemical engineering perspective. They scaled that up directly from there and used this to recover the plutonium that was originally used in the fat napalm. So that was what was done. And so we may talk about some of the details of this. So this was the first process. The second process is what was called the redox process. We'll go ahead and talk about some of that. And then the third process was the Purex process. We'll kind of go ahead and march through all of these details. And I think that that's probably about as far as that we'll be able to get in considering some of these different chemistries. There's a lot of things that I do now looking towards advanced processes, but sometimes I think it's helpful if you guys have a little bit of a historic perspective. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Purex is basically free. So if there's a process that's going to be used, it's some derivative of the Purex process, okay? So in looking at this, let's see here. Oops, let's not use that eraser. So when we look at the bismuth phosphate process, this was actually, let's go ahead and make this right here. This was a solid liquid type process. So what you actually did, without getting into too much of the chemistry, is that you would add basically bismuth phosphate, and this would selectively precipitate plutonium. Plutonium and actually some limonite as well. So it would separate that. It would leave the rest of the fission products, the rest of the periodic table out. It would not precipitate uranium. And uranium is basically about, 98% of what you actually had from your original fuel element, right? And so it doesn't, it sends all of that to waste. And so that's one of the reasons the bismuth phosphate process, even though we only used it for about 6 years, and I think the Purex process ran for about 50 years at Hanford, it actually produced the same amount of waste as the Purex process. So it produced a lot of waste because you were spending uranium, obviously, to recover that. And so it's a solid liquid process. You precipitate plutonium, and that's basically how that works. For that reason, so we'll go ahead and make a note here. Lots of waste produced. We'll sort of get that. When we look at the redox process, so this was actually the first process that used solvent extraction. For the recovery of used nuclear fuel. And solvent extraction, what this was, when you're a chemist and you're trying to develop a separation, all you're looking for usually is some sort of change of physical state. So you either want solid in a liquid, liquid in a gas, a liquid to another liquid. And so that's what solvent extraction is. So a lot of times you'll hear this referred to as liquid extraction. And so this is basically, you have an aqueous phase, you have an oil phase. You've done this experiment probably once before in the 2nd grade or something, and you mix these things and you see that they phase separate very readily. That's all solvent extraction is. So there's manipulation of that. Solvent extraction has a lot of benefits from the perspective that it's very easy to engineer a continuous process associated with this. So you can imagine this pump and play. It's got, remote handle this, remote control this, and it hits the technical specifications that can be used to weaponize the fuel itself. So there are other separations that will use ferrite plutonium, but probably not if you want to purify tons of material quickly. So let's make some notes about solvent extraction. So solvent extraction. This is basically your oil, water separation. So we'll say very high throughput. And can you manage removal? Okay. Which nuclear fuel, not that I spent much time thinking around it, but it's pretty radioactive. So you don't want to be standing right next to it using the most refined chemistry that's ever been developed. So those are all reasons that you stick with solvent extraction. And so there were issues with the Purex or the redox process that we won't necessarily get into because of time constraints, but one of them is that when you have the organic phase that they were using was very inflammable. So that can make for an interesting engineered scale process. They also used some other reagents that generated a polymer. The process was able to get away from that. And so that's part of why we use Purex nowadays. So let's talk about Purex, since this is really where the rubber ends up being. So Purex. Have you guys talked about Purex at all yet? I don't think so. All right. So this stands for your plutonium, uranium, redox, extraction. So that's what Purex stands for. So we've got plutonium, uranium, redox, and like this as such. Extraction. Okay. This was developed out of Oak Ridge and Ames, Iowa, actually, that was working on looking at recovery of lanthanides and things of that nature. So that was kind of where this started, and it ended up getting scaled up at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and then also used at the Savannah River site, or Savannah River National Lab. And so Savannah River National Lab, because it came to name a little bit later, they only have to clean up waste that was associated with the Purex process. Makes things a lot easier as far as a chemical management standpoint. And so with Purex, you've got a reagent that does all the work, and this reagent is called tributyl phosphate. So what this, and it looks, for those of you that have had organic chemistry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, how many people in here have organic chemistry? Okay, all right, so there's a couple of you that are like, gosh, thank goodness I took that class. It's really coming in handy now. So you use this reagent called tributyl phosphate. And basically what this does is, if you put a chemical reaction on the board, you'll feel your key. You'll have something like plutonium, which is tetravalent usually. So plutonium will actually take on a lot of different oxidation states, but the tetravalent state is its preferred state. You'll have something like plutonium with nitric acid. So you use very concentrated nitric acid usually to dissolve the fuel, something on the order of usually anywhere from a butane more to maybe more concentrated than that. Do we remember our strong acids from general chemistry? Maybe. So, okay, so we got hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, sulfuric acid. Nitric acid is a strong acid. And so this dissociates as soon as you put it in solution, right? That's the definition of a strong acid. And so you immediately get these free nitrate ions, right? So because it completely dissociates. And then you have a couple, your tributyl phosphate, okay? I'll put an overbar on this. So this means that it's in the organic phase. And so what needs to happen to drive a charged metal ion into an organic phase, so remember from chemistry that light dissolves light, right? And so if you have something that's polar, it doesn't want to go up into an organic phase, that's just stay in the lower. So what these nitrates actually end up being really important because 4 of them will interact with the plutonium and charge neutralize it. So that drives it up into the organic phase. And then this oxygen right here is very electronegative. And so it binds with the plutonium as well. So what you end up with, if we complete this reaction, is plutonium, nitrate, PVP. And usually there's about a couple of PVPs on there, 2 to 3. And so we'll just go ahead and see. And this is what ends up getting extracted, okay? Yeah. uranium does go through this reaction. So yeah, so good question. So yeah, if you guys, yeah, like I said, please don't hesitate with questions. So uranium does the same thing. If you have this, we'll go through. Now you need a couple of nitrates, right? And then you just do a couple of tributyl phosphates still, and you get your silicon. Okay, so uranium and plutonium go through this. The follow-up question is, why doesn't everything else? Right? Why don't, yeah.
So this is still a sort of oil water.
So what's happening here? Maybe this will help clarify things. So this is where you have your TDP. It's in your oil. And then this is where you originally have your metal. So your uranium, plutonium initially dissolved in nucleus phase, and then you contact them with the oil phase and they partition up there. Does that help?
Yes.
Precisely. Yeah, it's a thermodynamically favorable, if you'll allow me that. Any other questions? Okay, so you've got this and we've got our nucleus phase. So the reason why other metal ions don't participate in this chemistry is in part because really what drives your interaction with this reagent is the amount of charge density. So if you think of chemistry just as an extension of physics, how reactive are these things going to be? The more charge density, the more reactive they are, more charge density they have. And so a lot of the other elements that we're trying to separate these things from are only 1+, monovalent, divalent, 2+, etc., maybe 3+. I know that this, I've got a 2+ here. It turns out actually that uranyl itself, so what you have here, when I draw that, that's the uranyl cation. So this is something that forms pretty readily in your solution. This is usually what your uranium form is in. So this is your uranyl. Even though I'm drawing this, usually the convention is to see this as 2+. The charge density on this uranium itself is actually closer to 3.3. So it is actually more charge dense than a lot of the trivalent ions. And so that's why you can generate a separation on that basis. Okay? So there's charge density, and then there's also the fact that when you look at something like plutonium, we're throwing 4 nitrates and 2 extractants around, right? So the metal ion itself needs to basically have a lot of coordination space. It needs to interact with a lot of different things, right? If it's relatively small, it's not going to be able to interact with these things. And so things, when you go to the bottom of the periodic table, the elements get bigger, right? And so they've got more room to bind, more room to interact. You can put more things around them. That's the other reason why you can actually design separations of these guys away from the rest of the periodic table. Is this helping some? We're doing a lot of chemistry. So that's what ends up happening here. So we do the tributyl phosphate, we've covered that, we've covered the uranium. And so now what ends up happening, if we look at this, here's the other, this is the point that I was originally going to. So now we'll talk about the Chateliers principle, right? So if nitrate is a part of the forward extraction, do we see extraction of plutonium and uranium under high acid concentrations or low acid concentrations? High. Yeah, you see it under high acid concentrations, right? So it turns out that this is really compatible with how you dissolve the fuel in the first place. You needed a lot of acid to dissolve your fuel, then the next thing you want to do is extract it out of something that has a lot of acid in it, right? And so that's part of what drives this. And so if you want to, one of the rules, one of the tenets of solvent extraction is whatever goes up must come down. You want to be able to recover everything. And so how might you recover the plutonium or uranium from that perspective? Would you maybe contact it with less nitric acid? So more dilute nitric acid? So that's what you actually do. So you extract these things under fairly high acid conditions, and then, so maybe on the order of 4 molar, and then you use much less acid to recover them back into the aqueous phase. And so that's basically how it works, whereas it's classically called the nitrate swing. So that's what drives that. So it's important to understand this because at some point we want to selectively recover the plutonium, right, away from, or if that's your goal. And so to do that, let's go ahead and break this down. So usually when you're running a word processing scheme, step 1, dissolve fuel, right? So usually this is done in high acid. So on the order of 8 to 12. Which concentrated at nitric acid is on the order of 16 molar. So you really use quite concentrated material. So you dissolve this. Then 2, contact with, let's see here, TVP organic physics. So now when you do this, so now when we're at step 2 here, you've got your uranium and your plutonium, and then you basically left behind your fission products and maybe some of your other heavier actinides, so like americium. So that's where we set basically after step 2. Now, step 3 is usually recover plutonium. Now, it turns out that plutonium is really what we would call redox active, and so it changes oxidation states. And so when I was hammering that we don't recover trivalent actinides or lanthanides, this is partially why I hammer on that, because this is how you recover plutonium from things. And it's plutonium's ability to change oxidation states is fundamentally one of the challenges in designing a proliferation-resistant process, because this is actually how you separate plutonium away from pretty much everything else. Okay, so that's a ramification of chemistry right there. So you recover plutonium. As I mentioned, it is, you usually have it in a tetravalent state, but you can reduce, right? So oil rig, reduction, oxidation is lost, reduction is gained. So you can throw electrons on plutonium, and you can make it plutonium-free. And so now, what happens when I've reduced the plutonium in this system? And I've made it trivalent. Is it going to stick around in the organic phase? No. Okay, good. Excellent. It's going to drop back into the aqueous phase. And so how this usually sets up is you have a series of what are called centrifugal contactors. They use centrifugal forces to run the separation concurrently. And so what will happen is you'll basically be mixing things. I need to draw a better contactor. And basically you'll end up with phase separation in this direction instead of up and down, right? Because you're applying a centrifugal force to it. And so in this stage, your heavier phase is going to be inside here. So this is basically your aqueous phase, right? And then this is your oil phase. And depending on where you set up your inlets and outlets, you can siphon off the materials with right separation into other contactors. And so that's how you do this on an engineered scale. Because now you take it to a contactor that has an inlet for low acid or a reducing agent to reduce the plutonium. Usually, just as an aside, we'll use something like iron 2+ was what they used back in the Manhattan project. Iron 2+ is still be pretty common. There's a lot of different reduction producing agents that are used, and usually kind of in modern day Purex facilities, that's usually one of the biggest variations as to how you run the process. Is what's your reducing agent? How did you get the plutonium to the titan state? It's all based on getting plutonium to the titan state somehow. Okay? So you recover plutonium by reducing it, and then step 4 is actually basically you recover your uranium, and this is done by contacting things with low acid. And so that's how that sets up. And that's really reprocessing 101. You vary your plutonium oxidation state to get it where you want it to go. Uranium is not redox active, and so it will stay in the hexavalent state in that neocation configuration. And that's really how you design a separation in this regard. So, any questions as of right now?
You have to somehow think about this event, and you have to track. You have to get there determine how to stop that.
Oh, as far as with the plutonium itself, how do you get it?
Yeah, I was just wondering about that.
Oh, okay. So once you've selectively recovered the plutonium by itself, because you did the reduction, and so now you have this plutonium stream. Then basically you've got it in an aqueous phase, so you have to drive off water and then reduce it, usually using some sort of mechanism, whether you want to do that electrolytically or with other more aggressive metallic reducing agents. But it depends on that side of the fuel cycles, how you want to manage that. And that's another place where you can have a lot of variability. So, and the separations things. So, yeah.
So why instead do you separate and not separate? I think that.
Oh, sorry. So actually, during this entire time, you're using centrifuges. So that, I apologize. It dawned on me as I was talking about that I hadn't set up for you guys how this looks. Like, how are you taking material in and out and changing these? So you're using centrifuges the entire time that you're doing this. So centrifugal contactors.
So even in step 1, where you fill the box with, it's actually happening.
It's actually happening in a centrifuge. So, thank you. So, any other questions?
So, we have some questions for this class, and parent class, study, given statements made by them after the election, Japan and Korea may have gotten rather decided that they no longer want to U.S. nuclear field, and I think things Japan had options for their own program. Either system their own nuclear program. So we've got 8 substances that have red teams, so forth here. One of the questions is a country that do not have any access to its customers, what are the typical signatures you might look at in terms of the cost of the chemical industry, economics, music, whatever. What would your signature that this is done?
That you were starting to have, well,
We've got a processing program. Is it easy to do?
well, so the hardest place where you're going to pick up on some of this chemistry, or the hardest place to pick up on this would be countries that already have processing facilities available, and then they're just diverting the material. So France does law, and they just decided to not. box fuel with that and instead make weapons with it, that's going to be the most difficult thing to pick up on. And actually, I don't know that you'd see changes necessarily in the processing, but in how they're originally handling their radiation times, it would probably be a bigger separate signature for that. Now, if we start talking about proliferation concerns, that's actually a big thrust of the Department of Homeland Security right now. And usually what they're looking at isn't so much, well, they're probably considering things on the front end, but we have projects looking at basically, say the uranium crossed the border and wasn't supposed to. What are some of the chemical processing signatures that would be inherent in the sample? Could you track this maybe to the hog? Or is this a homegrown, done in a shed type operation? Which you can imagine would have its own challenges, radiation challenges, and trying to do this in a shed. But I don't, considering people will fly into buildings, and risk their own lives for them. These are maybe not safe assumptions to make that, they would necessarily they would potentially try to reprocess fuel or limited amounts of it with, little concern with their own safety, right? And so the things that you would probably see in a sample that was, maybe done under more crude conditions than something that was done in the hog is more fission products maybe than you were actually in the sample, right? A sample coming out of the clean processing facility is going to have much tighter specifications on the amount of fission products that carry over. They're going to do a better job of separating those things. So that's potentially one. That's probably one of the bigger things that you could look at. There are other things that you could look at. So I would say the DHS kind of has this goal of, can you tell if it is done in a shed somewhere versus the hog? Okay, good. Now can you tell the hog from material that came out of H Canyon and Savannah River National Lab? That would have been both very technically sophisticated. And then there are other signatures that kind of depending on how that process was ran specifically. And so that can depend on the engineered facility, how the facility was engineered itself, is probably one of the bigger ones, and there are other aspects that end up happening. That is how the chemical signatures would look for that. If you were interested in seeing some of these aspects on the front end, unless they didn't have a processing facility to begin with, they did, unless they didn't have one, then you would probably end up with, when you saw truckfuls of nitric acid being shipped somewhere, that would be something that, okay, because they literally brought this up in rail trucks to Savannah River National Lab originally. And so they were just taking nitric acid off the rail trucks. And then, so if you see that level of scale of shipment, there's not really that many processes that use nitric acid as much anymore. That's probably, this chemistry is not that green. Most other chemistries have become much more sophisticated than this. This is really old chemistry. So that would probably be something that would tip me off. If you started to see tribunylphosphate being shipped in enormous quantities, this would be another really big signature that, okay, maybe we have a process going on here that we should. Those would be some of the biggest things. Iron sulfonate is the reducing agent that's customarily used to reduce plutonium. That would be another signature. So these are all things that you might have an eye towards. Now, TDP can also be used for other ramifications in industries, as far as like the pyro retardant, and it does some other things. But for the most part, I don't think if you were you would use it in larger quantities for a reprocessing scheme, even if you were just trying to get the minimum amount of plutonium to make weapons than you might in some of these other industries. So those will be kind of my observations about that. Okay, so yes, that's basically how that ends up setting up. Is you recover uranium with nitric acid. Now, a little bit. I don't know how we're doing on time here. Maybe about 15 more minutes. Is that about? Yeah. So now the other thing is how can you make these processes more proliferation resistant, right? Is we've recovered. This is a pretty big game. And so usually what they're trying to do is avoid a recovery of plutonium just by itself, right? Because that's, if you recover plutonium by itself, this is certainly the most straightforward path to making a weapon. And so there's other actinides that you can co-recover with plutonium that can maybe make that more difficult. And so usually when we're trying to improve proliferation resistance, let's go. So, all right, so how to improve proliferation resistance. From a separation standpoint, your biggest, the most simple thing that you're going to be able to use to accomplish this is co-recover other actinides with plutonium. Now, when I say other actinides, really what I mean is neptunium. And so I didn't demonstrate this, but so the Purex process recovers hexavalent actinides and tetravalent actinides. It's basically what it's designed to do. So neptunium usually does not exist in either one of those states, but you can actually drive neptunium's chemistry pretty easily upwards towards the hexavalent state or the tetravalent state so that it can be recovered with them. And so that's with the uranium and plutonium. And once you do that, the neptunium will pretty much follow the plutonium through the processing scheme because it's much more, like I said, redox active. And so that's one of your goals here. So we'll go ahead and make a note. Can readily change the oxidation state of neptunium such that it extracts with uranium. All right. And then once it's co-recovered with plutonium, it will basically strip with plutonium. And so that's one way that you can go about this. And so that's part of why when you look at next generation fuel cycles, there's usually some sort of combined extraction of neptunium with plutonium, or some of the things you're talking about today, maybe recovering rhenium with plutonium, or things that will basically make it more difficult to use the plutonium in a weapon. So that's basically how that ends up setting up there. Now, let's see, is there anything else that I specifically have? I don't think so. So with that in mind, I'll talk maybe just quickly over some other other chemical processes that people are looking at, just quickly, for waste management, because this is also another thing that sort of complicates the dialogue about why people might be interested in reprocessing. One of the drivers potentially for reprocess is so the actinides actually contribute significantly to the long-term burden, waste burden timeline of managing nuclear material. So usually this is on the order of 2 to 6 to 10 to 7 years if you have to worry about your nuclear material. If you could co-recover more of the actinides and separate them out, and put them back into a reactor, then basically you would be in a situation where maybe you're using nuclear fuel probably would only be on over 400 years, we'll say as a straw man. And so 400 years is a much more attractive timeline for managing nuclear waste than necessarily a much longer timeline, right? And so those are some things that we consider. So here's some of the things that advanced nuclear fuel cycles consider. So usually they're looking at the separation and recovery of amines. And so when you look at these things, so we've got uranium, then neptunium, then plutonium, and then americium. And so that's usually about the heaviest that you have to worry about from a waste management standpoint. The curium that's made has such a short half-life that it's really, the shorter the half-life, the more radioactive it is, and the more difficult it is to handle. So we just let the curium decay away. We don't worry about separating out the curium. The problem is that americium typically has very different chemistry than the uranium, neptunium, and plutonium. And so uranium, neptunium, and plutonium all can conform to this yield geometry that I mentioned, right? Where you've got the two oxygens and the actinide in the middle there. Americium really does not want to do that. And so you have to develop separation. It actually has chemistry very similar to the lanthanides. And so if it is participating as a lanthanide, then it's difficult to separate from the lanthanides. Is really one of the biggest problems. And so we'll make a note here. So separation of americium from lanthanides is a challenge because they have the same chemistry, basically the same chemistry. And so the lanthanides, of course, are fission products. So basically, it's difficult to recover americium from certain fission products because they have the same chemistry. And so this is a big push right now as far as one of the reasons why you might be interested in peaceful separations of nuclear material. And I touch on this only for a little bit so that way you guys understand from a policy perspective and when you're thinking about motivations for people to be involved in different things as far as whether it's waste management or weapons type design, is there are reasons for looking at separations for waste management, and there are programs designed to try and get at things like americium, neptunium, and plutonium, and it's really for peaceful waste management purposes. And so really it's sort of a balance between understanding what the goal of that country is. Are these signatures for peaceful reprocessing, or are these shorter radiation times, pure plutonium streams, truckloads of nitric acid that don't seem necessary at a given facility to try and draw some of that out, okay? So, and with that, I think that the crowd's going to be a little sleepy-eyed. I'll take it, yeah.
So one of the things with this student project is the issue of stockpile.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights in their whole handling of the things they use, anything special?
So,
that would let you know that you're going to have to take this or
so if you really start looking at, so another aspect that I didn't touch on too much is, so usually you'll use solvent extraction for bulk of tons of material. This will not give you the weapons grade spec chemical purity that you would like for a weapon. complete. So there's usually follow-up processes to clean up the material more rigorously, and those use solid liquid separations or chromatography. And so that would be something that you would be attentive to, as far as, are they ordering ion exchange columns, or what is the status of their fume hoods and glove boxes, and kind of things of that. So that would be another thing that you would keep an eye on. So
Specialists, again, they know the signature. The guys are immediately looking for the US that they have there. So how do they defeat your approach?
So the hard thing about this, right, is that ion exchange resin is used for lots of different things. And so you can use this in a nuclear reactor and you do use this in a nuclear reactor to maintain high purity in your reactor water and all that sort of stuff. And so there's a lot of different places that you can probably funnel this through pretty easily that wouldn't necessarily indicate that you're using this for. And part of it also, I think probably the biggest thing that depends on is time. How aggressive are they willing to be in competition? Are they willing to be patient that you can move these materials around slowly, and it's going to be much, you're going to be less apt to see it. Buy something. You want to be more aggressive. So, what would be my sense on this? Sure. Yeah. So I think that, so this is actually part of why we went towards plutonium correction, was because plutonium correction is actually cheaper than trying to enrich uranium. And so that's why the U.S. moved in this direction, generally speaking. There are other infrastructure challenges in machining of plutonium weapons. If you're really talking about going about this from the ground up, as far as the specifications on a plutonium weapon relative to a uranium weapon. And so that's usually why, when it comes down to this, people will argue if you're a non-state entity, it's much more attractive for you to buy the material right than to make it outright, just because of the specs and the infrastructure that's required. Now having said this, I've worked loosely in this space. It's not my bread and butter as far as non-proliferation and looking at these sorts of signatures. So I want to, yeah. But those are some of the things that end up playing into this. So.
All questions.
So if you compare the sizes of the facilities that we use historically, they're on the order of several football fields long. So these are not small facilities, but you're talking about, something in between. Yeah, so and that's kind of it doesn't necessarily need to be back there, I don't think. And another part of it depends on what your source of food are. Could you be getting things that are virtually a lot of the reason, or is it stuff that's decayed away for 20 years already, right? So this is another big issue. It's one thing if you're pulling it directly out of the reactor. You need hot cells and every other thing and infrastructure to manage that. If this material's been sitting around in Russia or wherever else for 40 years, all of a sudden the infrastructure needs that you have is significant, or if it's been through some stage of partial treatment. And so does that all kind of, a lot of it depends on your source where you get it. Yeah.
So when you're talking about earthquake resistant processing, and you mentioned including that mean that if it's been sitting around for the treatment, they become more?
Oh, no, so this should inherently make this less usable as a weapon. So the Neptunium 237 that's usually made, that undergoes alpha decay, what you put Titanium 233. I could be wrong on that. And so usually, and it's got a pretty long half-life. So the Neptunium 237 has a half-life on the order of several 100,000 years. And so it's slowly decaying to Protactinium 233. Oh no, so it's inherently in there already because basically when you run a reactor, you're making the uranium, so you got uranium, right? Uranium-238. It makes Neptunium-239. That goes away fairly quickly. That's relatively. So it's the Neptunium-237, and so you can either get that via decay of Americium-241 or potentially neutron radiation of uranium-235 if they didn't take from there. And so usually it's probably the neutron radiation of uranium-235 that's right now. So yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's what's going on there.
And another question. So I heard that the U.S. stopped pursuing processing for proliferation reasons because certain countries haven't done nuclear tests with the reactors that were going. What do you think the capabilities of a country that is irradiating the field for long periods of time refuse to have reactor?
So this ends up probably a bit in a phase space where my combined limited expertise and probably classification things end up clicking into this. So yeah, as far as how much can you flirt with that line regarding the amount of plutonium-239 to plutonium-240 ratio, I would suspect that it sits somewhere in there. So I apologize that I don't have a better answer to that, but I will say that you from everything that I understand, you do not need weapons grade plutonium necessarily to make it quite the device. So you want a sufficient device, but so fair enough?
Yeah.
Anything else? This ties directly into that issue what was touched on earlier about bridging the gap between young people and people that were actively engaged with the weapons program. So one of my favorite collaborations right now is with somebody at Los Alamos National Lab that was active, hired on as a postdoc in the 70s and participated in some really fascinating experiments. And just trying to spend as much time as I can learn as much as I can from Bob has been, unfortunately, he's very engaged in this, and he recognizes that this is a national security issue on many levels, that this expertise, we don't have programs set in place to develop that. And so whether it's been working with him, who was much more involved in the physics and that aspect of the weapon side, people who spent time at the Hanford site when we were actively recovering and processing plutonium at a significant scale. I've worked with those people at PNML as well. And find if you're enough in this field that you just can't spend enough time on them, the level of operational expertise that they have. So, yeah. Oh, you're fine.
Are there specifically radioactivity
Oh, as far as specific typing and things of that nature. So usually, so the reason, one of the reasons why we use nitric acid is because nitric acid doesn't react with stainless steel. So usually, use hydrochloric acid, the stainless steel goes away pretty quickly. So usually these things have a certain level of robustness built into it from that perspective. Usually, if it was a type of processing facility that was trying to process fresh fuel, it's usually on concrete. And these things are plumbed pretty significantly to be able to manage all of the stages. And so sometimes it's just sort of a sheer volume of things that are maybe being ordered relative to that. So again, if you're talking about a full-scale processing facility. Anything else, guys? Sure. In theory, you potentially could, right? And that was part of what I think the first, from what I understand about the first Iraq war, that's precisely what Iraq was trying to do. They were not using this type of chemistry to get their uranium-235 enriched, because this doesn't enrich uranium-235, but they were doing what are called gas-phase separations. And so basically, for those of you that haven't ever seen a mass spec or understand that you can ionize something and separate it on its mass to charge ratio in the presence of a magnet, that's basically what they were doing. And so they were just being patient and running this material through a mass spec, kind of slowly. And so you can get into other aspects as far as enrichment that way, or I can imagine a chemical process where patient enough, you could probably then find some kind of that balance of aggressiveness versus patience. And certainly, if you're more patient, I'll advise you you'll fly under the radar, but you may not end up with the material. Anything else? Well, hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Yeah.
I think I may have mentioned earlier my boss hired me a little more than 95 days as part of the unsigned core in Iraq in 1992. And they discovered weapon identity separation program, which completely blindsided them. It was very successful. It was much better than what we done in the Manhattan Project. And the reason they not discovered it is the Iraqis had been smart enough to very colorblind. So our national did not see what we normally would have told the outside there was a massive amount of the desert. It was very colorblind. Completely missed it from really actually not. Therefore, it's very common. You could see the massive operation. Lots of things going on.
There's modernizing their electrical grid. Not everybody wants overhead power these days.
Actually, much more data and you have young people, well prepared people who study analog stuff. And there's very often get a result.
That was absolutely brilliant. It was stunningly brilliant to do that without, and then just go to the board and talk your way through it. It was absolutely brilliant.
Oh, thank you. No, I was like, oh man,
No. That's because when you go to we go into mindset research, when we do graphs, we tend to accelerate